Hello there, and welcome to the Psyche's Rest channel. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most profound mysteries hidden in plain sight. The way you see the world, the way you hear these words, the way reality itself unfolds before you. It's not quite what it seems. What you perceive as the world around you is not a direct recording of reality. It's something far more remarkable. It's a construction, a masterpiece of interpretation, crafted moment by moment inside your mind. Tonight, we'll wander through the fascinating landscape of perception, discovering how your brain doesn't just receive information from the world, but actively builds your experience of it. We'll explore the hidden processes that turn meaningless patterns of light into faces, objects, and meaning. We'll discover why illusions occur and what they reveal about the machinery of consciousness. And we'll learn how attention, expectation, and even culture shape what you see, hear, and feel. You might find your eyes growing heavy as we journey through these ideas. That's perfectly fine. Let the concepts wash over you like gentle waves. And if sleep finds you along the way, welcome it. There's no need to hold on to every detail. Just let yourself settle in, breathe slowly, and allow your mind to wander through these quiet revelations. If you enjoy these nighttime explorations of the mind, feel free to like and subscribe below. And if you have thoughts to share, the comments are always open. But for now, all you need to do is get comfortable. Let your body relax, your breathing deepen, and together we'll discover how you construct the world you perceive. Let's begin. Your brain is always guessing what you see. Every moment of every day, as you move through what feels like a solid, reliable world, your brain is engaged in something closer to educated guesswork than perfect recording. The colors, shapes, and objects that seem so vivid and certain are actually your brain's best interpretation of incomplete information. Consider this remarkable fact. By the time visual information travels from your eyes to your brain, about 90% of it has been lost. The light that enters your eye passes through layers of cells, crosses synapses, travels along neural pathways, and arrives at your visual cortex dramatically reduced. What reaches your brain is not a complete picture, but fragments, hints, suggestions of what might be out there. So how do you see anything at all? How does your mind construct the rich, detailed world you experience from such sparse data? The answer lies in one of the most extraordinary abilities your brain possesses. It fills in the gaps. It makes inferences. It builds a model of reality based partly on what it receives and partly on what it expects to find. This insight isn't new. In the 19th century, a German physician and physicist named Hermann von Helmholtz proposed something radical for his time. He suggested that vision wasn't simply about light hitting the eye and creating an image in the mind, like a photograph developing in a dark room. Instead, he argued, vision required what he called unconscious inference. The brain, he believed, was constantly making assumptions and drawing conclusions from incomplete sensory data, all without your conscious awareness. Helmholtz was remarkably prescient. Modern neuroscience has confirmed and expanded his vision, revealing that perception is indeed a constructive process. You don't passively receive the world, you actively create it moment by moment using sophisticated neural machinery that has evolved over millions of years to turn ambiguous signals into actionable understanding. Think about what this means. The world you see right now, the room around you, the screen before you, the subtle play of light and shadow, none of it is presented to you as it truly is. What you experience is your brain's best guess, its most useful interpretation, and most of the time those guesses are so accurate, so seamless, that you never notice the construction happening at all. But sometimes the construction becomes visible. Sometimes the brain's assumptions lead it astray, and we catch a glimpse of the machinery underneath. These moments, when perception diverges from reality, when the brain's guesses prove incorrect, are what we call illusions. And far from being failures, they're windows into how perception actually works. The process of perception begins long before conscious awareness. It starts the moment light enters your eye, carrying with it patterns of energy that contain information about the world. This light passes through the cornea, the clear outer layer of your eye, and then through the pupil, that dark opening that expands and contracts to control how much light enters. Behind the pupil sits the lens, which focuses the incoming light onto a thin layer of tissue at the back of your eye called the retina. The retina is where the magic begins. This delicate layer contains millions of specialized cells called photoreceptors, two types in particular, rods and cones. Rods are exquisitely sensitive to light and dark, allowing you to see in dim conditions, though without much color. Cones, more numerous in the center of your vision, respond to different wavelengths of light, giving you the experience of color. Together, these photoreceptors transform light into electrical signals, the language your brain can understand. But here's where things get interesting. The signals from your photoreceptors don't go straight to your brain in their raw form. First, they pass through several layers of other cells in the retina itself, cells that begin processing and filtering the information before it even leaves the eye. Some of these cells enhance edges and contrasts. Others respond to specific patterns or directions of movement. The retina isn't just a camera sensor. It's the first stage of interpretation. From the retina, visual information travels along the optic nerve, a bundle of about 1 million nerve fibers, toward the brain. But it doesn't head directly to the visual cortex, the part of the brain dedicated to processing vision. First, it makes a stop at a structure deep in the center of your brain called the lateral geniculate nucleus, or LGN, a small region in the thalamus. The LGN acts as a relay station and filter. It receives input from the retina and begins organizing it, separating information about color from information about form, dividing signals from the left and right eyes, and preparing the data for the cortex. Even here, far from conscious awareness, your brain is already making decisions about what information matters, what should be amplified, and what can be set aside. Only after passing through the LGN does visual information finally reach the primary visual cortex, known as V1, located at the very back of your brain in the occipital lobe. V1 is where conscious visual perception begins to take shape, though the picture is far from complete. In V1, neurons respond to basic features of the visual scene, things like edges, orientations, and simple shapes. Some neurons fire when they detect a vertical line. Others respond to horizontal lines or diagonal ones or curves of particular angles. From V1, information flows forward through a hierarchy of visual areas, each one building on the work of the previous stage. In area V2, neurons begin combining simple features into slightly more complex forms. In V4, color processing becomes more sophisticated. In area V5, also called MT, neurons specialize in detecting motion and tracking moving objects through space. And in higher areas like the inferotemporal cortex, neurons respond to specific objects, faces, and complex visual patterns. This journey from light to perception takes time, though not much. Studies using advanced neuroimaging have shown that it takes approximately 160 milliseconds for visual information to travel from your eye to the point where you can recognize and classify an object. 1/6 of a second. In that brief instant, your brain transforms meaningless photons into meaningful experience, turns patterns of light into people, places, and things. But even this description makes it sound more straightforward than it is. The visual system doesn't work like a simple assembly line, with information flowing neatly from one stage to the next until a finished perception emerges at the end. Instead, there's constant communication in both directions, feedback as well as feed forward, with later stages of processing influencing earlier ones, expectations shaping how raw data is interpreted, and context determining what features get emphasized or ignored. This bidirectional flow of information points to something profound about how perception works. It suggests that seeing isn't just about bottom-up processing, where sensory data flows from the outside world inward to the brain. It's also about top-down processing, where knowledge, expectations, and context flow from the brain outward, shaping how incoming sensory information is interpreted. These two streams, bottom-up and top-down, work together continuously, seamlessly, to create your perceptual experience. And understanding how they interact is key to understanding how you construct reality. When you look at something, two types of processing happen simultaneously, though you're aware of neither. The first, bottom-up processing, is driven by the stimulus itself, by the actual patterns of light entering your eyes. It's data-driven, moving from sensation toward perception, from simple features toward complex understanding. Bottom-up processing is what happens when light hits your retina, when photoreceptors fire, when edge detectors in your visual cortex respond to contrasts in the visual field. It's the brain responding directly to what's actually there in the environment, building perception from the ground up, feature by feature. But bottom-up processing alone isn't enough. If your brain relied only on incoming sensory data, perception would be impossibly slow and effortful. You'd have to carefully analyze every edge, every color, every shape before understanding what you're looking at. Worse, you'd struggle to make sense of ambiguous images, shadows, partially hidden objects, anything that doesn't present itself clearly and completely. This is where top-down processing comes in. Top-down processing is driven not by the stimulus, but by your knowledge, expectations, and context. It's conceptually driven, moving from perception toward sensation, from understanding toward features. Your brain uses what it already knows about the world to interpret incoming sensory information more efficiently. Consider a simple example. Imagine you're reading text where every third letter is slightly blurred. You might not even notice the blur because your brain, using top-down processing, fills in the missing information based on your knowledge of language, the context of the sentence, and your expectations about what words should appear. You don't consciously work to decode each blurred letter. Your brain does it automatically, seamlessly, using what it knows to interpret what it sees. Top-down processing is why you can recognize a friend's face even in poor lighting, why you can understand speech in a noisy room, why you can identify objects from unusual angles or partial views. Your brain doesn't wait for complete information. It makes predictions based on past experience and uses those predictions to guide perception. Research in neuroscience has revealed just how powerful these top-down influences can be. Studies show that activity in higher brain regions, areas involved in memory, attention, and expectation, can actually modulate activity in early sensory areas like V1. In other words, your expectations can literally change how neurons in your visual cortex respond to incoming stimuli. In one striking experiment, researchers asked participants to view ambiguous images that could be interpreted in multiple ways. By manipulating what participants expected to see, by priming them with suggestions or context, the researchers could change not just how participants reported seeing the images, but how their visual cortex actually processed them. Expectation didn't just influence judgment, it influenced perception itself at one of the earliest stages of visual processing. The interaction between bottom-up and top-down processing is constant and complex. Bottom-up signals provide the raw material, the constraints that keep perception tethered to reality. Top-down signals provide the interpretation, the meaning, the context that makes raw sensation intelligible. Together, they create a perceptual experience that is both grounded in the external world and shaped by your internal mental life. But this raises a fascinating question. If perception is constructed through this interplay of data and expectation, of sensation and interpretation, how do we know we're perceiving reality accurately? How do we distinguish between what's really out there and what our brain adds to the picture? The answer, uncomfortable as it might be, is that we often can't. Our perceptions feel direct and unmediated, but they're always filtered through the lens of our brain's interpretive machinery. And sometimes that machinery produces experiences that diverge from physical reality in systematic, revealing ways. One of the most influential frameworks for understanding this construction comes from what neuroscientists call predictive processing. This is a theory that has gained considerable traction in recent years, and it offers a compelling vision of how the brain may create perception. According to this framework, your brain is not passively waiting for sensory information to arrive. Instead, some researchers believe it's constantly generating predictions about what it expects to encounter. These predictions are based on your past experiences, your current goals, the context you're in, everything your brain knows about how the world typically works. When sensory information does arrive, your brain doesn't just process it directly. Instead, it compares the incoming data to its predictions. If the sensory input matches what was expected, all is well. the prediction is confirmed, and your perception proceeds smoothly, effortlessly. But if there's a mismatch, if the sensory data doesn't match the prediction, your brain registers a prediction error. These prediction errors are important. They signal that something unexpected is happening, something that requires attention and adjustment. When your brain detects a prediction error, it can do one of two things. It can update its predictions to better match the sensory data, essentially learning from the mismatch. Or it can weight the predictions more heavily, treating the prediction error as noise, as unimportant deviation from what it expects to be true. Which option your brain chooses depends on context, on how reliable the sensory information seems, on how strong your prior expectations are. But the key insight of this theory is this. According to this view, perception emerges from the brain's attempt to minimize prediction errors, to find the best match between what it expects and what it receives. This might sound abstract, but it has profound implications. If perception is fundamentally about prediction, as this theory suggests, then what you experience may not be a direct representation of the world. It could be your brain's best hypothesis about what's causing the sensory signals it receives. In the words of neuroscientist Anil Seth, perception might be understood as a kind of controlled hallucination. According to this view, your brain constructs your reality, and when it gets things right, when its construction matches the world, you call that accurate perception. This idea echoes Helmholtz's unconscious inference, but it goes further. This framework suggests that all perception, not just visual perception, may arise from this same process of prediction and error correction. When you listen to music, your brain might predict the next note based on the patterns it has heard. When you reach for a cup, your brain appears to predict the sensations you'll feel when your hand makes contact. When you walk through a familiar room in dim light, your brain seems to predict the locations of furniture and obstacles based on memory. Most of the time, these predictions are so accurate that you never notice them. The world feels solid, immediate, real, but occasionally the predictions fail, and suddenly the constructive nature of perception becomes visible. You reach for a step that isn't there and feel that jarring moment of surprise. You mistake a stranger for a friend and experience a flash of confusion. These moments, small as they are, reveal the predictive machinery at work. And then there are illusions, those strange perceptual experiences where what you see consistently diverges from what's actually there. Illusions are perhaps the most direct evidence we have that perception is constructed, not given. They show us the brain's predictions in action, the assumptions and shortcuts that usually serve us well, but sometimes lead us astray. One of the most powerful frameworks for understanding how we organize visual information comes from a group of German psychologists working in the early 20th century. They call their approach Gestalt psychology, from the German word Gestalt, meaning form or shape. Their central insight was simple but profound. The whole is different from the sum of its parts. The Gestalt psychologists Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Köhler, and Kurt Koffka were interested in how we perceive organized wholes rather than collections of isolated features. When you look at a face, you don't see two eyes, a nose, and a mouth as separate objects. You see a face, a unified whole. When you listen to a melody, you don't hear a sequence of individual notes. You hear a song, a pattern that has meaning beyond its components. This led them to propose a series of principles, rules of thumb, that describe how the brain organizes visual information into meaningful patterns. These principles aren't conscious strategies you apply. They're automatic, hardwired into your perceptual system, operating beneath awareness to structure your visual experience. The most fundamental of these principles is the law of prégnance, sometimes called the law of simplicity. It states that your brain will organize ambiguous visual information into the simplest, most stable form possible. When faced with multiple possible interpretations of a visual scene, your brain tends to choose the interpretation that requires the least complex explanation, that fits the most regular, orderly pattern. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, researchers suggest. In a complex, often ambiguous world, a bias toward simplicity may help you make quick decisions with limited information. It could keep you from getting lost in endless possible interpretations and help you focus on the most likely, most useful understanding of what you're seeing. Building on this foundation, the Gestalt psychologists identified several specific principles that govern perceptual organization. One of the most powerful is the principle of proximity. Simply put, objects that are close together in space tend to be perceived as belonging together, as forming a group. If you see a collection of dots scattered across a page, with some dots clustered close together and others spread apart, your brain automatically groups the nearby dots into units, seeing patterns where there are only individual elements. Similarly, the principle of similarity states that objects that look alike tend to be grouped together. If some dots are red and others are blue, your brain will group the red dots with each other and the blue dots with each other, even if they're not particularly close in space. Similarity in color, shape, size, or any other feature creates perceptual bonds, linking elements into coherent groups. The principle of closure describes your brain's tendency to complete incomplete figures, to fill in gaps in visual information. If you see a circle with a small segment missing, you don't perceive it as an arc or a curved line. You perceive it as a circle, complete, with a missing section filled in by your brain. This is predictive processing in action. Your brain using its knowledge of common shapes to interpret incomplete sensory data. Another principle, continuity, states that your brain prefers to perceive continuous, flowing lines and patterns rather than sudden changes in direction. If you see two lines that intersect, and those lines seem to continue smoothly on both sides of the intersection, your brain will perceive them as two continuous lines crossing rather than as four separate line segments meeting at a point. Perhaps the most striking Gestalt principle is figure-ground organization. This describes your brain's ability to separate visual scenes into a figure, the object of focus, and a ground, the background against which the figure appears. This separation isn't given in the sensory data itself. Light reflected from the figure and light reflected from the ground arrive at your eye as a unified pattern. But your brain interprets this pattern, deciding which parts represent objects and which parts represent space. Sometimes, figure-ground relationships are ambiguous, and your brain can flip between different interpretations. The famous Rubin vase is a perfect example. You can see it as a white vase against a black background, or as two black faces in profile against a white background. The sensory input doesn't change, but your perception flips back and forth, demonstrating that figure-ground organization is an act of interpretation, not a given feature of the stimulus. All of these principles work together, often simultaneously, to help your brain organize the continuous stream of visual information into meaningful, structured perceptions. They're shortcuts, heuristics, ways of quickly making sense of complex sensory data, and they work remarkably well most of the time, allowing you to navigate the world efficiently and effectively. But because they're based on assumptions about how the world typically works, they can be fooled. When the visual input violates these assumptions in systematic ways, the result is an illusion, a perception that diverges from reality in predictable, revealing ways. Illusions are not failures of perception. They're windows into how perception works. Every illusion demonstrates a principle, reveals an assumption, shows you the machinery of your mind in action. And far from being rare curiosities, illusions are everywhere, built into the very fabric of how you see. Consider the Müller-Lyer illusion, one of the most famous and studied perceptual illusions. It consists of two lines of equal length. One line has arrowheads pointing outward at both ends, like this, is greater than is less than. The other has arrowheads pointing inward, is less than is greater than. Despite the lines being identical in length, the first line appears longer than the second. Why does this happen? One explanation some researchers propose involves your brain's interpretation of depth cues. The outward-pointing arrows may resemble the far corner of a room or building, receding into the distance. The inward-pointing arrows may resemble the near corner, projecting toward you. Your brain, using its knowledge of perspective and depth, could interpret the first line as farther away. And if it's farther away but produces the same size image on your retina, then your brain might reason it must be longer in reality. So your brain adjusts your perception accordingly, making the line appear longer than it is. This is top-down processing in action. Your brain's knowledge about depth and perspective influences how you perceive simple line length. The illusion reveals that you don't see line length directly. You see your brain's interpretation of line length, an interpretation shaped by context and expectation. Another striking example is the Canizza triangle, named after the Italian psychologist Gaetano Canizza, who first described it. In this illusion, three Pac-Man-like shapes are arranged in a triangular formation, with their mouths facing inward. Most people see a bright white triangle in the center, its edges clearly defined, sitting on top of the three shapes. But there is no triangle. The edges you perceive so clearly aren't drawn. They exist only in your mind, constructed by your visual system. The Canizza triangle demonstrates the principle of closure, your brain's tendency to complete incomplete shapes. But it goes further, showing that your brain doesn't just passively fill in missing information. It actively constructs visual features, edges, and boundaries that have no physical correspondence in the stimulus. You're not just interpreting what's there, you're creating something that isn't. This is one of the most profound lessons illusions teach. Perception isn't reconstruction, it's construction. Your brain doesn't build an accurate copy of the external world. It builds a useful model, one that's usually good enough to guide behavior, but that sometimes diverges from reality in revealing ways. Motion illusions provide another window into perceptual mechanisms. The phi phenomenon, described by Max Wertheimer in 1912, is a simple but powerful demonstration. If two lights are placed side by side and flashed in rapid succession, you don't see two lights blinking separately. You see a single light moving from the first position to the second. Your brain interprets the sequential flashing as motion, filling in the movement between the two positions. This is how motion pictures work, how animation creates the illusion of smooth movement from still images. It's also why flashing lights on a sign seem to flow or chase each other. Your brain is so attuned to detecting motion that it creates motion perception even when objects aren't actually moving. More complex motion illusions can be even more striking. The rotating snake illusion, created by psychologist Akiyoshi Kitaoka, consists of circular patterns of carefully arranged colors and contrasts. When you look at the image, the circles appear to rotate continuously, even though the image itself is completely static. The illusion is so powerful that it can be difficult to convince yourself that nothing is actually moving. The mechanism behind this illusion appears to involve the timing of neural responses in your visual system. Different colors and contrasts are processed at slightly different speeds. When these elements are arranged in particular patterns, the staggered timing of neural firing may create an illusion of movement, a signal that your brain interprets as rotation. These examples, and countless others, demonstrate something important about your visual system. It's not designed to represent reality with perfect accuracy. It's designed to extract useful information quickly, to guide behavior, to help you navigate and interact with the world. And most of the time, the shortcuts your brain takes, the assumptions it makes, the predictions it relies on, work beautifully. But illusions show you the edge cases, the situations where the assumptions don't hold, where the shortcuts lead astray. And in doing so, they reveal the constructive nature of all perception. Even when you're not experiencing an illusion, even when your perception matches reality accurately, the same constructive processes are at work. You're always interpreting, always predicting, always building your experience from incomplete information and prior knowledge. Your attention is more limited than you realize. We tend to think of perception as a kind of spotlight, illuminating everything within its beam with equal clarity. But that's not how it works. Perception is selective, focused, dramatically constrained by the limits of attention. And the consequences of these limits can be startling. Consider a famous experiment conducted by psychologists Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris. They showed participants a short video of two teams passing basketballs back and forth, one team wearing white shirts, the other wearing black. Participants were instructed to count the number of passes made by the team in white, a task that required focused attention. Partway through the video, something unexpected happened. A person in a full gorilla suit walked into the middle of the scene, stopped, beat their chest, and walked off. The gorilla was on screen for 9 full seconds. It was dark, large, and moved directly through the center of the action. What fraction of participants noticed the gorilla? Only about half. The rest, focused intently on counting basketball passes, were completely blind to the gorilla's presence. When told about it afterward, Many refused to believe it until they watched the video again. This phenomenon is called inattentional blindness, the failure to notice unexpected objects when attention is engaged elsewhere. The gorilla experiment became famous because it so clearly demonstrates something counterintuitive. We assume that if something is right in front of us, if we're looking directly at it, we'll see it. But visibility is not the same as perception. Without attention, even salient, obvious features of a visual scene can go completely unnoticed. Inattentional blindness reveals something fundamental about how perception works. You don't perceive everything in your visual field with equal fidelity. Instead, perception is selective. You perceive what you attend to, and attention is a limited resource. When attention is directed toward one task, one object, one stream of information, it can't be fully directed elsewhere. And without attention, perception is impoverished or absent altogether. This isn't a bug in your perceptual system. It's a necessary feature. The amount of sensory information available at any given moment is enormous, far more than your brain could possibly process in detail. If you tried to consciously perceive every edge, every color, every movement, every sound, every texture within range of your senses, you'd be overwhelmed, paralyzed by information. Attention solves this problem by filtering. It selects what's relevant, what's important, what's aligned with your current goals and expectations, and it processes that information deeply while largely ignoring the rest. This allows you to function efficiently, to focus cognitive resources where they're needed most. But it also means your experience of the world is much more fragmentary than it feels. You have the subjective impression of rich, detailed perception across your entire visual field, but that impression is largely an illusion. In reality, you perceive only a small fraction of the available information in high detail, filling in the rest with expectation and assumption. This is demonstrated beautifully by another surprising phenomenon called change blindness. Change blindness occurs when you fail to notice significant changes in a visual scene. Even when you're looking directly at it, if those changes occur during a brief interruption, like a blink, a saccade, the rapid movement your eyes make as they shift focus, or a momentary occlusion. In one experiment, a researcher approached pedestrians on a college campus to ask for directions. While the pedestrian was giving directions, two workers carrying a large door walked between the researcher and the pedestrian, momentarily blocking the view. During this interruption, the original researcher was replaced by a different person, different face, different voice, different clothes. About half of the participants didn't notice the switch. They continued giving directions to the new person as if nothing had happened, completely unaware that they were now talking to someone else. Their attention was on the task, on explaining directions, not on encoding the details of the person they were talking to. So when the person changed, the change went unnoticed. Change blindness and inattentional blindness are related phenomena. Both demonstrate that attention is necessary for perception. Without attention directing your cognitive resources to a particular stimulus, that stimulus may not enter conscious awareness at all, even if it's physically visible and even if you're looking right at it. These findings have important implications. They suggest that your subjective experience of seeing a rich, detailed, continuous world is something your brain constructs. You feel like you see everything in front of you, but you don't. You see what you attend to, and your brain fills in the rest with predictions and assumptions, creating a seamless experience that masks the fragmentary nature of actual perception. This construction happens so smoothly, so automatically, that you never notice the gaps, but they're there. Every time you shift your eyes, there's a brief period during which vision is suppressed to prevent you from experiencing motion blur. Every time you blink, visual input is momentarily absent. And throughout all of this, there are vast regions of your visual field that you're not attending to, not processing in detail, not consciously perceiving, yet your experience is not one of gaps and interruptions. It's continuous, stable, complete. Your brain bridges the gaps, maintains continuity, creates the impression of uninterrupted perception even when perception itself is fragmentary. This is another form of construction, another way in which the brain actively builds experience rather than passively receiving it. Attention also interacts with expectation in interesting ways. Studies have shown that you're more likely to notice unexpected objects if they're similar to what you're expecting. In the gorilla experiment, if participants were told to count passes by both teams rather than just one, more of them noticed the gorilla, perhaps because counting both teams required a broader attentional focus. Similarly, if the unexpected object is very different from the attended objects, it's less likely to be noticed. But if it shares features with the attended objects, like color or shape or movement pattern, it has a better chance of capturing attention and entering awareness. This suggests that attention isn't just about where you look or what task you're performing. It's also about what features you're tuned to, what your brain is expecting and prepared to process. Attention creates a kind of filter, a selective window through which only certain kinds of information pass easily. Understanding the limits of attention and perception can be humbling. It reminds you that your experience of the world, vivid and detailed as it feels, is not a complete or objective picture. It's a selective, constructed experience, shaped by what you attend to, what you expect, and what your brain considers relevant. Two people can look at the same scene and perceive entirely different things, not because their eyes are different, but because their attention, expectations, and prior knowledge shape what they construct from the available information. You don't perceive with just one sense at a time. This might seem obvious, but the implications are profound. The world doesn't arrive at your mind neatly divided into separate sensory channels. Instead, your brain continuously integrates information from multiple senses, combining what you see, hear, feel, taste, and smell into a unified perceptual experience. This integration, called multisensory or cross-modal perception, is so seamless that you usually don't notice it happening. But when senses provide conflicting information, the integration process becomes visible, revealing the active role your brain plays in binding sensory modalities together. One of the most striking demonstrations of multisensory integration is the McGurk effect, discovered by psychologist Harry McGurk in the 1970 seconds. It demonstrates how vision and hearing interact in speech perception. Here's how it works. Someone records a video of themselves saying one syllable, like ga. Then they record audio of themselves saying a different syllable, like ba. When you combine the video of the person saying ga with the audio of them saying ba and play them together, something strange happens. You don't hear ba, even though that's what the audio actually contains. And you don't see ga, even though that's what the lips are forming. Instead, your brain blends the conflicting information from vision and hearing, and you perceive a third syllable entirely, something like da or tha. The percept you experience doesn't match either the visual or the auditory input alone. It's a compromise, a synthesis created by your brain as it tries to make sense of conflicting signals. The McGurk effect is powerful and automatic, even when you know it's an illusion, even when you close your eyes and hear the actual sound clearly. When you open your eyes and watch the video again, you'll still perceive the blended sound. Your brain automatically integrates visual and auditory information in speech perception. And this integration overrides the actual auditory input. This reveals something important. Speech perception, something we think of as primarily auditory, is actually multisensory. You don't just hear speech, you see it, you watch lip movements and facial expressions, and your brain uses all this information together to determine what's being said. In noisy environments, this visual information becomes especially important, helping you understand speech that would be unintelligible from sound alone. Multisensory integration extends far beyond speech. Your sense of taste, for instance, is heavily influenced by smell. Much of what you think of as taste is actually olfaction, the detection of airborne molecules by receptors in your nose. When you eat, volatile molecules from the food travel up the back of your throat to your nasal cavity, where they activate olfactory receptors. Your brain integrates this olfactory information with taste information from your tongue and textural information from touch receptors in your mouth, creating the rich, complex experience you call flavor. This is why food tastes bland when you have a cold and your nose is stuffed. It's not that your taste buds have stopped working. It's that olfactory information, a crucial component of flavor perception, is blocked. The integration process that normally creates rich flavor perception can't happen normally, and the result is diminished experience. Vision and touch also integrate in interesting ways. When you pick up an object, what you see influences what you feel. Studies have shown that the perceived weight of an object can be influenced by its visual appearance. Larger objects feel lighter than smaller objects of the same weight, a phenomenon called the size-weight illusion. Your brain expects larger objects to be heavier, and when they're not, the expectation influences perception, making them feel lighter than they actually are. Similarly, texture perception involves both vision and touch. Before you touch something, you often have expectations about how it will feel based on how it looks. Smooth surfaces look shiny, rough surfaces look matte, soft materials look different from hard ones. These visual cues prime your touch perception, influencing what you experience when you actually make contact. Sometimes, the integration of senses can produce experiences that blur the boundaries between modalities. This happens in its most dramatic form in synesthesia, a condition in which stimulation of one sense reliably triggers experiences in another sense. People with synesthesia might see colors when they hear sounds, taste shapes, or associate specific colors with specific letters or numbers. For someone with grapheme color synesthesia, the most common form, each letter or number has a consistent color. The letter A might always appear red, B might be blue, and so on. These colors aren't imagined or metaphorical. They're actually perceived automatically and involuntarily whenever the person encounters the letter or number. Synesthesia isn't a disorder, it's a variation in how the brain processes sensory information. Estimates suggest that about 4% of the population has some form of synesthesia, though many people might not realize their experiences are unusual. For those who have it, synesthesia is just how they've always perceived the world. Research suggests that synesthesia may result from increased connectivity between brain regions that normally process different senses. In typical brains, these regions communicate, allowing multisensory integration. But in synesthetic brains, the communication may be more direct or more extensive, leading to experiences where sensory boundaries blur. But even people without synesthesia experience cross-modal correspondences, systematic associations between features in different sensory modalities. For example, most people associate high-pitched sounds with brightness and light colors, and low-pitched sounds with darkness and heavy colors. Sharp, angular shapes seem to go with harsh, staccato sounds, while smooth, rounded shapes pair with soft, flowing sounds. These correspondences aren't arbitrary. They reflect regularities in how different senses typically co-occur in the world, patterns your brain has learned from experience. High-pitched sounds often come from small, light objects. Low-pitched sounds come from large, heavy ones. Smooth shapes often have smooth acoustic signatures when struck or scraped. Your brain has learned these statistical regularities, and they influence how you integrate information across senses. When sensory inputs align with these learned correspondences, integration is smooth and effortless. When they conflict, you might experience something jarring, a sense that something doesn't quite fit. All of this suggests that perception is fundamentally multisensory. The division of experience into separate senses, sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, is partly artificial, a way of categorizing different types of sensory receptors and neural pathways. But at the level of conscious experience, the senses work together, informing and influencing each other, creating a unified model of the world that transcends any single modality. This integration is another form of construction. Your brain doesn't just passively receive separate streams of sensory data and present them to consciousness side by side. It actively binds them together, resolves conflicts, creates correspondences, and builds a coherent multisensory experience that feels whole and unified. The way you perceive the world is not universal. Culture, the beliefs, practices, languages, and environments you grow up in shapes perception in subtle but significant ways. People from different cultural backgrounds don't just interpret the same percepts differently. They can actually perceive differently, attending to different features, organizing information according to different patterns, and constructing different perceptual experiences from the same sensory input. Much of the research on cultural differences in perception has focused on a broad distinction between analytic and holistic cognitive styles. These terms describe different ways of attending to and processing visual information, patterns that appear to correlate with cultural background. Analytic cognition, more common in Western cultures, particularly North America and Western Europe, emphasizes separating objects from their contexts, focusing on individual objects and their attributes, and using rules and categories to organize information. When looking at a complex scene, people with an analytic style tend to focus on salient foreground objects, paying less attention to background and contextual information. Holistic cognition, more common in East Asian cultures, emphasizes relationships between objects and their contexts, attending to the whole field and understanding objects in terms of their connections to the environment and other objects. People with a holistic style tend to distribute attention more broadly, taking in background and context as well as focal objects. These differences have been demonstrated in numerous studies. In one classic experiment, researchers showed American and Japanese participants images of scenes containing a focal object, like a tiger, against a complex background, like a jungle. Later, they tested participants' memory for the scenes. American participants showed better memory for the focal objects and were less affected when the background changed. Japanese participants showed better memory for contextual details and relationships between objects and backgrounds. When shown focal objects against different backgrounds, they were more likely to notice the change and found it more disruptive to recognition. These findings suggest that cultural background may influence not just what you remember, but what you attend to in the first place. Attention, as we've seen, is crucial for perception. If Americans and Japanese participants are attending to different aspects of visual scenes, they may be effectively perceiving different things, constructing different representations from the same physical stimulus. Language may play a role in shaping these differences. English and other Indo-European languages tend to emphasize objects and agents, structuring sentences around nouns and actors. East Asian languages like Chinese and Japanese place more emphasis on relationships and contexts, often allowing subjects to be omitted when they're understood from context. These linguistic patterns could encourage different attentional habits. Some researchers believe if your language constantly directs you to identify and name focal objects, you may develop a tendency to attend to those objects. If your language emphasizes relationships and contexts, you may develop a broader, more holistic attentional style. Other cultural factors likely contribute as well. Social practices, environmental factors, even the density and arrangement of urban spaces can influence perceptual habits. Growing up in environments that emphasize independence and individual achievement may encourage analytic attention. Growing up in environments that emphasize interdependence and social harmony may encourage holistic attention. Cultural differences also appear in emotional perception. Several studies have found that East Asians are more likely than Westerners to attend to contextual cues when judging emotions. When shown a face displaying an emotion surrounded by other faces showing different emotions, East Asian participants' judgments about the central face's emotion were more influenced by the surrounding faces. This makes sense in light of the holistic attentional style. If you attend more to context and relationships, the emotional expressions of people around an individual may naturally influence how you perceive that individual's emotion. You might not be seeing just an isolated emotional expression. You could be seeing an emotional expression embedded in a social context, and that context shapes your interpretation. Culture can even influence low-level perceptual processes. Some research suggests that East Asians and Westerners differ in susceptibility to certain visual illusions. The Muller-Lyer illusion, for example, appears to be stronger in Western participants than in participants from some non-Western cultures. This could be because the illusion relies on interpreting angled lines as depth cues representing building corners, a more common feature of Western architectural environments. These cultural differences in perception remind us that perception is not a simple readout of objective reality. It's a constructive process shaped by experience, and different experiences lead to different constructions. There's no single correct way to perceive. Instead, there are culturally shaped perceptual habits, learned patterns of attention and interpretation that influence how you construct your experience of the world. This doesn't mean perception is entirely relative, or that all perceptual experiences are equally valid. There are universal aspects of perception, constrained by the shared architecture of human sensory systems and brains. But within those constraints, there's room for variation, for different ways of organizing and interpreting sensory information. Understanding cultural differences in perception can foster humility and curiosity. It suggests that your own perceptual experience, as immediate and obvious as it feels, is one way of constructing reality among many possible ways. Others may be attending to different features, organizing information according to different principles, and constructing different but equally valid perceptual experiences. All of this construction, all of this processing, all of this active interpretation happens in your brain. And while we've discussed perception largely at a functional level, describing what the brain does, it's worth taking a moment to consider where and how it does it, to glimpse the neural architecture that supports your perceptual experience. Visual information, as we've seen, travels from the retina through the lateral geniculate nucleus to the primary visual cortex, V1, at the back of the brain. V1 is remarkable in its organization. It contains a topographic map of the visual field, with adjacent regions of V1 responding to adjacent regions of space. If you could watch V1 activity while someone looked at a scene, you'd see a distorted but recognizable spatial map of that scene painted across the surface of the cortex. But V1 doesn't just passively represent the visual field. Its neurons are specialized, responding selectively to specific features of visual stimuli. Some neurons respond preferentially to edges of particular orientations, others to specific colors or wavelengths of light, still others to direction of motion or binocular disparity. This specialization allows V1 to decompose the visual scene into elementary features that can be further processed by later stages. From V1, visual information flows forward through a hierarchy of extrastriate visual areas, each building on the processing of the previous stage. In area V2, representations become slightly more complex, with neurons responding to combinations of features and beginning to show some invariance to exact stimulus position or size. In area V4, located in the lower temporal lobe, color processing becomes more sophisticated. V4 neurons respond to colors in ways that reflect color constancy, the ability to perceive consistent colors despite changes in illumination. Damage to V4 can result in achromatopsia, a condition in which the world appears drained of color, seen only in shades of gray. In area V5, also called MT for middle temporal neurons, specialize in motion processing. They respond to the direction and speed of moving stimuli, often with remarkable selectivity. Damage to V5 can cause akinetopsia, the inability to perceive motion. People with this condition see the world as a series of frozen snapshots, with objects suddenly appearing in different positions without the experience of movement between those positions. Beyond these intermediate areas, visual processing splits into two major streams, a division first proposed by neuroscientists Leslie Ungerleider and Mortimer Mishkin, and refined by David Milner and Melvin Goodale. The ventral stream, sometimes called the what pathway, projects from V1 through V4 into the inferior temporal cortex. This stream is involved in object recognition, identifying what objects are, distinguishing faces, reading words, recognizing patterns. Neurons in the inferior temporal cortex respond to complex visual patterns. Some neurons fire preferentially to faces, others to hands, others to specific objects. These neurons show considerable invariance, responding to their preferred stimuli across changes in position, size, viewing angle, and lighting conditions. This invariance is crucial for object recognition, allowing you to identify a cup as a cup, whether it's near or far, upright or tilted, well lit or shadowed. The dorsal stream, sometimes called the where or how pathway, projects from V1 through V5 into the posterior parietal cortex. This stream is involved in spatial processing, locating objects in space, guiding movements, and coordinating action. Damage to the dorsal stream can impair the ability to reach for objects accurately, judge distances, or navigate through space, even while object recognition remains intact. Interestingly, the dorsal stream appears to process visual information in a different way than the ventral stream. While the ventral stream constructs representations that reach conscious awareness, the dorsal stream often operates unconsciously, rapidly processing visual information to guide movement without that information entering conscious perception. You might consciously recognize a cup through your ventral stream, while your dorsal stream unconsciously computes its location and guides your hand to reach for it. This separation between perception for recognition and perception for action reveals something profound. There isn't a single unified visual representation in your brain. Instead, there are multiple, parallel representations serving different functions. The world as you consciously perceive it is constructed by some systems, primarily the ventral stream, while other systems, like the dorsal stream, use visual information in ways that may never reach consciousness. All of these visual areas are highly interconnected, not just in feed-forward fashion, but with extensive feedback connections as well. Higher areas send signals back to lower areas, modulating their activity, implementing top-down influences, and allowing expectations and context to shape even early sensory processing. This bidirectional flow supports the predictive processing framework, with predictions flowing down and prediction errors flowing up through the hierarchy. Moreover, visual areas don't operate in isolation from the rest of the brain. They're connected to regions involved in memory, attention, emotion, and motor control. The hippocampus, crucial for memory, receives input from high-level visual areas and can influence what visual information gets encoded and remembered. The amygdala, involved in emotion, can modulate visual processing, making emotionally salient stimuli more likely to capture attention and enter awareness. The prefrontal cortex, involved in executive control and attention, sends projections to visual areas, implementing attentional selection and biasing processing toward task-relevant information. When you decide to look for something, frontal regions influence visual areas, priming them to respond preferentially to features of the target object. This distributed, interconnected architecture means that perception isn't localized to a single place in the brain. There's no central screen where visual information is displayed, no theater where you watch the movie of your experience. Instead, perception emerges from the coordinated activity of many brain regions, each contributing different aspects of processing, each influencing and being influenced by others. The neural basis of perception is still being unraveled. Neuroscience has made remarkable progress, identifying many of the brain regions involved, mapping their connections, and beginning to understand how they function. But fundamental questions remain. How does the activity of neurons give rise to conscious experience? How does the brain bind together information from different regions into unified percepts? What makes some neural activity conscious and other neural activity unconscious? These questions touch on the hard problem of consciousness, the question of how and why physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience. Perception sits at the intersection of this problem, a phenomenon that is clearly tied to specific neural processes, but that also involves something deeply subjective, the felt quality of experience, what philosophers call qualia. As you rest here, letting these ideas settle gently in your mind, you might reflect on what all of this means for how you understand your experience. You've learned that perception is not a passive process, not a simple recording of reality, but an active construction. Your brain doesn't receive the world. It builds a world using fragmentary sensory input as raw material and prior knowledge as scaffolding. This construction happens through the interaction of bottom-up and top-down processing, with data from the senses meeting expectations from memory and context. It's organized according to principles like the Gestalt laws, grouping elements into patterns, separating figures from grounds, completing missing information. It's shaped by attention, which selects what gets processed deeply and what remains peripheral or unconscious. It's influenced by culture, which provides different attentional habits and interpretive frameworks. It involves integration across multiple senses, binding sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell into unified experience. And it all happens in a distributed network of brain regions, hierarchically organized but extensively interconnected, with constant communication in both directions supporting prediction, error correction, and learning. What does this mean for your experience of reality? It means that what you perceive is not the world as it is, but the world as your brain constructs it. And that construction, while generally reliable, is shaped by your particular sensory systems, your particular brain architecture, your particular history of experiences, your particular cultural background, your particular state of attention and expectation in each moment. Two people standing side by side, looking at the same scene, are not perceiving the same thing. They're each constructing their own version of the scene based on what their senses detect, what their attention selects, and what their brain predicts. The difference between these constructions is usually small enough that people can communicate, coordinate, and agree on what they're perceiving. But the difference is real. This can be an unsettling realization. We tend to feel that our perception is direct, immediate, and accurate. We trust what we see and hear. We believe our senses give us truth. Learning that perception is constructed, filtered, interpreted, can feel like losing our grip on reality. But there's another way to think about it. The fact that your brain constructs your experience is what makes experience possible in the first place. Raw sensory data is meaningless, just patterns of energy impinging on receptors. It's the brain's constructive work, its predictions, interpretations, and integrations that turns those patterns into the rich, meaningful, navigable world you experience. Perception is not a failure to see reality. It's an achievement, a remarkably sophisticated process that has evolved to help you survive and thrive. The shortcuts your brain takes, the assumptions it makes, the predictions it relies on, these are features that make perception fast, efficient, and useful. And when you understand how perception works, you can develop a different relationship with your experience. You can notice when your expectations are shaping what you see. You can recognize that others might be constructing different perceptual realities. You can cultivate curiosity about the limits and biases of your own perception, approaching your experience with a bit more humility and wonder. You can also appreciate the sheer complexity and beauty of what your brain does every moment. Each glance, each sound, each touch is an opportunity for your brain to perform this extraordinary feat of construction. Integrating information, making predictions, building a model of reality that's good enough to guide you through the world. As you lie here, perhaps feeling sleep beginning to pull at the edges of your awareness, you might notice your own perception shifting. The sounds in the room become less distinct. The visual details fade. Your sense of your body softens. Even these changes are construction, your brain adjusting its models as you transition from wakefulness to sleep. And in sleep, the constructive nature of perception becomes even more evident. In dreams, your brain constructs entire worlds with no sensory input at all. Pure construction, unmoored from the constraints of external data. The people, places, events of dreams feel real in the moment, vivid and immediate, even though they're generated entirely internally. This tells you something profound. The machinery of perception, the neural processes that construct your waking experience, are capable of creating rich, detailed, meaningful experiences with or without sensory input. The difference between waking perception and dreaming is not that one is constructed and the other isn't. Both are constructed. The difference is that waking perception is constrained by sensory data, kept tethered to external reality through the continuous flow of information from your senses. When that tether loosens, as it does in sleep, the constructive process continues, but it's free to create according to different rules, guided by memory, emotion, and the brain's own internal dynamics, rather than by the external world. In this light, perception is revealed as one of the great mysteries of consciousness, a bridge between the physical world and subjective experience, a process that turns light into color, vibrations into sound, and chemicals into taste. It's the way the objective becomes subjective, the way the external world enters your inner life. And though science has made great progress in understanding how perception works, in mapping the pathways and processes, in identifying the principles and mechanisms, the fundamental mystery remains. How does matter become mind? How does neural activity become experience? How does the physical process of constructing perception give rise to the felt quality of seeing, hearing, touching? These questions may not have complete answers yet, but they invite wonder, invite a sense of awe at the ordinary miracle of perception, the fact that you can experience anything at all, that there is something it is like to be you, perceiving, constructing, experiencing the world. The world you see when you open your eyes tomorrow morning will be your construction. The faces you recognize, the objects you use, the scenes that unfold around you, all of it will be built by your brain, actively, continuously, seamlessly. Most of the time, you won't notice the construction. It will feel direct, immediate, true. But perhaps, knowing what you now know, you'll occasionally catch a glimpse of the process. You'll notice an expectation shaping what you see, an assumption filling in missing information, attention directing your perception toward one feature and away from another. And in those moments, you'll be witnessing the extraordinary machinery of your own mind at work, building the only reality you'll ever know. For now, let these thoughts rest gently in your mind. There's no need to hold on to them tightly. They'll be there if you wish to return to them, questions to contemplate, ideas to explore further. Right now, you can simply let yourself be, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of your body, allowing your awareness to soften and blur. If sleep comes, welcome it. If your mind continues to drift through these concepts, let it wander without effort. The mystery of perception, the way your brain constructs your reality, will still be there tomorrow. Tonight, you can rest in the knowledge that even as you sleep, your mind continues its work, building dreams from memory, constructing experiences from pure imagination, demonstrating once more its remarkable power to create worlds. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the architecture of perception. If you found this exploration calming and would like to rest with more ideas about the mind, feel free to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle companion for sleep. For now, let your thoughts settle like leaves drifting slowly to the ground. Let your breathing deepen and allow the constructed reality you've been perceiving to fade gently into the constructed realities of dreams. Sleep well, rest deeply, and good night.